A quick video, and this one might actually be a little scattered, so that will give those who don't want to listen and don't want to think, it'll give them plausible deniability to say, you're all over the place, he gave a rambling speech. But it goes something like this. This is how you socialize a culture to be desensitized to murder. First, a little bit of history about how the United States became a superpower, and then a little bit of talk about the murders and the deaths and murders, that we feel bad about, that we even celebrate how terrible they are, and then the deaths that we ignore and how we use the deaths that we feel bad about to justify ignoring the majority of deaths. Thus we create a culture that is completely desensitized to death that doesn't matter. First, you got to realize that murders like the thousands of murders in Mexico owed to the gangs and the government being the only ones with guns. 90% of the men, 90% of the people who are murdered in Mexico are men. The 10% of women are focused on. Travyon Martin was killed in the United States. Between the time of his murder and the trial, 10,000 black people, especially black men, were killed. Paul Walker of Fast and Furious died recently. Princess Diana died. Nelson Mandela died. Why do their murders matter? Why murders or just deaths? Why do their deaths and murders matter? In order to control population and to socialize people into believing that some murder or just death doesn't matter. Keep going. It goes something like this. After World War II, the United States became the sole superpower. I'm only mentioning that to say, that's a historical fact. I'm only mentioning that to say, if you think that the United States became the sole superpower, and then from then on they just were doing good stuff, and sometimes something would happen and they'd have to defend, or something would happen they would defend, that's just not reality. Further, if you think that the United States just tells you what it's doing, again, there's Bradley Manning in jail being tortured for disclosing as an army officer that the United States military tortures and kills unnecessarily. The United States military and the government are not against doing heinous shit. One of the ways they get away with heinous shit is by something called a PSYOP. PSYOP is psychological operation. These things started probably before World War II, but they became hugely popular after World War II, in no small part because in war, when you win, you get land, you get people, you get stuff. One of the things that the United States government got after World War II were the psychological warriors, we could say, of Nazi Germany. They got all of the mind control experimenters, and they started working on drugs to control minds, but also media control to control minds. And that's where psychological operations, PSYOPs, became in full swing. Now, for example, what a PSYOP does is it makes you believe that our government couldn't possibly have done 9/11 to get us to kill more than 1 million Iraqis, take over some oil, $1 trillion worth of lithium in Afghanistan. Now just imagine this. Imagine it didn't happen. It happened exactly as the government says, and they didn't involve themselves. But imagine the mindset of somebody who could not possibly believe that the United States government would stage a false flag, a psychological operations to convince people to do a whole lot of heinous shit. After World War II, one of the biggest PSYOPs, psychological operations, to get people to do shit they otherwise wouldn't, was the Gulf of Tonkin. The United States government, in connection with the media government industrial complex, lied about United States Navy ships being attacked in the Gulf of Tonkin. They said, we were attacked, we need to go to war. They were going to go to war regardless. Much like when McCain was the war hawk and Obama was the peace person, we elected Obama, we went to war regardless. The Gulf of Tonkin led us into the Vietnam War. People like my dad were forced to fight. He's alive. 58,000 U.S. men were killed, forced to fight in these wars. We don't hear about it that much anymore because we've moved on. Another thing psychological operations do is when somebody like Princess Diana dies, that matters. And then you think, then the news is focused on, hopefully her driver stays alive in order to tell us what happened when that person who matters, Princess Diana, died. Psychological operations creating an insane culture that can justify murder and death. In Juarez, Mexico, since I think 1994, about 10,000 people have been murdered in Mexico in general, but especially in Juarez, Mexico. There have been a lot of news stories in the New York Times, etc., focusing on femicide, women being killed in Juarez, Mexico, and in Mexico in general. Women represent 10% of the murders in Mexico. The justification, it's another psyop of culture in general, the justification of putting all the focus on suffering of women is not because they value women. It's to justify ignoring all the men being killed. And in case you just joined us, one of the social control mechanisms for controlling men and women is to pretend you're doing something for the good of women and children, and then you can do whatever you want. For example, ignore 90% of murders in Mexico by focusing on the women. More and more women are going to realize that despite their hypocrisy, the women's hypocrisy, and their self-righteousness of really believing women are so much more important, despite all that, women aren't even well served by a culture that would justify ignoring 90% of murders for any reason, even to protect women especially. No, because you create a culture that is 9 times is willing to look at 9 murders and go, well, acceptable. 1 murder, not acceptable because of gender. Eventually you realize they don't even care about the gender. It's going to be poor women getting massacred too. That might be it. There were a couple of other... Oh, this all came about because somebody... I put up the picture that says between the time of Travyon Martin's shooting and the time of the verdict, 10,000 blacks were murdered by other blacks. Name one, it says. And that's to say that this Travyon Martin psyop, psychological operation, convincing people to focus on this murder and say, you know what the problem is? Whites attacking blacks. Then why don't we see 10,000 Travyon Martins? Well, we do. We see 10,000 dead black people, dead especially men, since Travyon Martin. But we don't see Obama speaking out and saying, if I had a child, it looked like this person, that person, that person. Why doesn't he say that 10,000 times? Why doesn't he say that specifically to Corey Jackson? Of course you don't know who Corey Jackson is. That's the person that the person on my Facebook put underneath as a comment. Name one of the people murdered since Travyon Martin. She named Corey Jackson. People don't know that because so much focus on the psyop. Here was my point for the video. Impossibly, after a psyop is in full effect, you cannot go against it. One of the things I mentioned is that when the Vietnam psyop was in full effect, you were forced to fight in war. My dad was forced to fight in war. A lot of Black Panthers were purged, sent into jail for refusing to fight this false war. That's how you break up political dissenters. Now, you cannot go against the Travyon Martin psyop, just as they couldn't go against the Vietnam psyop, without a whole lot of complicity and saying, of course they're getting jailed. They aren't patriots. They're not going and fighting the false war. Now, all you have to do, as I've mentioned, is so much as accurately portray the size of Travyon Martin, the drug habits of Travyon Martin, the violent, direct quotes of Travyon Martin. Suddenly you're racist and you're blaming the victim, this and that, because we've established he's the victim. We've established he's the little baby that was meticulously thrust upon culture. He's not who he was. He's the fantasy with the wings that people put up. That's the psyop. Now, when you point out, well, here's what Travyon Martin really looked like, really talked like, you're a racist. That plays into the real key of psyops, of psychological operations by the government to control people and socialize them to look past murder and death. It's about control. So you can justify washing away anything somebody such as myself would say against the Travyon Martin psyop narrative by the media government industrial complex. You can just say, He must be racist. No, nobody but a racist would talk bad about Travyon Martin, the hero. May he rest in peace, justice for Travyon and all that. How about justice for Corey Jackson? How about realizing that, as I've mentioned before, it's one thing to ignore 10,000 black murderers since Travyon Martin, since most of those people who killed the black people were black. It's one thing to ignore murderers. Because, well, yeah, but Travyon Martin was killed, so therefore we should focus on that, and there's this other stuff. It's one thing to ignore 10,000 black murderers since Travyon Martin. And that's a hell of a thing to ignore. And guilty white liberals ignore it because, no, it's kind of a form of reparations. A long time ago, something else happened to someone else. It was slavery. Therefore, we can justify ignoring 10,000 black murderers since Travyon Martin. It's one thing to do that. It's another thing to ignore 10,000 black murder victims on the altar of psychological operations, of pretending that if we all get together and lie to ourselves about Travyon Martin and that circumstance, that that's going to benefit black people. What about Corey Jackson and their family? What about the families of the driver of Princess Diana? When they were worried about him, it doesn't matter if Princess Diana died. Michael Jackson, the drug addict, died. Whitney Houston, the drug addict, died. Paul Walker, the child molester, died. You can go ahead and look that up. All of the children of the men who were killed in Juarez, Mexico. Well, speaking of Paul Walker, one more thing. Paul Walker was in the movie Fast and Furious. The reason why they called the gun operation Fast and Furious is because, well, it's kind of like the movie. It's this cool, fast operation where the United States government gave thousands of guns to the drug lords in Mexico amid an unarmed populace. Thousands of Mexicans were killed, and one United States Border Patrol agent was killed, and that's why when it started mattering. It's like Fast and Furious. That's what it's called. You can look it up, Operation Fast and Furious. So even as the focus is on Obama's a hero in changing things, the focus is on Paul Walker died, let's focus on that. Trayvon Martin's been shot, let's ignore all the real evidence and focus on these meticulous fabrications to justify staying divided and conquered and fighting over scraps off of a table of plenty based on racist psychological operations. You're welcome to go back to sleep.